Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of 52 Must See Movies and Why They Matter. And today we are back here once again with a bit of a big movie in our entire list. Perhaps the biggest to some, perhaps not. Who knows? Film is subjective after all. But today I'm once again joined by my friend Steven Billings. Steven, how are you?
Oh, doing good, doing good. It's Sunday night. It's just another day to just watch and talk movies. I mean, I guess there's no reason for me to say Sunday night because I do this every night. So, I mean, whatever.
Yeah, I know. No one out there cares what day we're doing this. They just care about the movie we're about to talk about. And the movie we're about to talk about is Citizen Kane from 1941. And if you are curious about where we're getting all of these movies from, all 52 of these bad boys, we're getting them from this book here that's put out by Turner Classic Movies, written by Jeremy Arnold, with the foreword by the late, great Robert Osborne. And this is where we're getting everything from, all 52. And today we are talking about a film that is regarded as one of, if not the best of all time. And it is certainly one of my favorites. I couldn't even tell you how many times I've seen this movie, but I rewatched it for this video here. Steven, I believe you've seen it before. This was not a first timer for you.
No, I mean, this is one of the movies that like I took a couple film classes when I was in college, and this is one of them ones that all film courses typically, this is a must, because it has not only it's not only a great movie in general, but a lot of the technical feats and things that happen in the movie are things that this movie is known for. So it's all around. It's just there's something about this movie that just has stood the test of time. So
Yeah,
it's
it is
yeah.
definitely film school 101. If you go to film school, if you take a film course, chances are you're going to run into Orson Welles' films, you're going to run into Citizen Kane, or perhaps some of his other films. And this is perhaps his best. Like I said, it's regarded as one of the best of all time. And before we really get into it, I just want to say we're going to spoil the heck out of it. But this movie did come out in 1941. It has been referenced in pop culture for decades now. I mean, chances are it's already been spoiled for you. I know it was spoiled for me before I saw the movie, and it really doesn't take away anything from the movie if you learn about the ending beforehand, because it's more about the journey and not so much the destination. This film is just astounding to me. It is one of those films that I specifically look to anytime I need some inspiration about filmmaking, need to know about filmmaking. Also, it's one of the films I kind of tell people to watch because you have to see it, but you also have to put it into context. When I talk about old classic movies, that a lot of the movies we've been talking about, look at them in context of when they were made, where they fit in the entire fabric of film history, because Citizen Kane is a gigantic film for film history. Before we get into the plot, it is one of those films that it was unlike anything else at the time. No film at that time was dealing with cinematography or story structure like this, or was really having the director be the producer, the writer, the star of the movie itself. I know that's commonplace now. Many directors do that these days, but at the time, no one did it. And Orson Welles was kind of a first. He was a first for many, many things, and there's nothing quite like an Orson Welles film. Nothing about his films feel generic in any way. And a lot of people tried to duplicate his style over time, but it's really just unique unto him. So right away, getting into it, we are told that the main character of this movie, Charles Foster Kane, hence why the movie's called Citizen Kane, has now died. We see his last moments of life, and one of the most iconic lines in movie history is uttered, Rosebud. And Steven, I don't know if you picked up this while the movie opened up, but it has a very ominous, almost horror film haunting type feeling, because when the film opens, we are uh, just abruptly introduced to Xanadu, his like 40 like 1,000 acre plantation castle realm, if you will, that I believe is located in Florida. It's got zoos, it has buildings, it has his house is basically a freaking castle. And when it opens up, it's dark, it's stormy, it's gloomy, it's at night, and we see him clutching that snow globe, and then close up of his lips, and Rosebud drops it, smash, and then we are given a kind of film reel clip reel of his life. And I always thought it was very interesting opening the film like that. It's like I said, this movie was extremely ballsy at the time. Nobody's opening movies with their main character dying. That doesn't happen in 1941. It rarely happens today. But Stephen, what do you extrapolate from this ballsy opening?
Well, I mean, first of all, like what you were saying, like very interesting opening. It almost feels like the horror movie aspect of that opening is like death is coming for him. You know, it kind of plays into what's about to happen, and what you know, the character of Charles Kane, who he became overall as a person, and also with the newsreel thing. I think that kind of plays into you know, some of the overall themes of the movie, mainly, you know, about public perception, what we know about somebody without really knowing somebody. You know, we see the media and they tell us how a person is, but is that really how they are? You know?
Yeah, this film takes the character of Charles Foster Kane and gives us various points of view of him, various kind of views of him, whether it's through this film reel at the beginning, which basically just paints him as this huge, you know, magnet of a person. You know, he ran the Inquirer newspaper business, which started out small and then amassed into an entire empire across the country. And he also owned a bunch of other industries that were successful. And he also fell on hard times during the Great Depression. It's very interesting how the Charles Foster Kane character is an amalgamation of a bunch of real life people at that time, particularly the persons of William Randolph Hearst, Samuel Insull, Harold McCormick, Howard Hughes was also another inspiration, as well as just Orson Welles' life. I mean, William Randolph Hearst was, I believe, a newspaper tycoon a la Charles Foster Kane, and very famously, William Randolph Hearst hated this movie, thought it was just poking fun at him, making him look bad, making him seem like a bad person. So he tried many different things to prevent the release of this movie, and it's all documented in various documentaries as well as books. You can look up that whole story. It's fascinating, just the making of Citizen Kane and its post-production life. But the film, as we all know, did get released in 1941, and Charles Foster Kane is now a part of film history and pop culture. And it's very interesting how, in this own Citizen Kane world, how big of a figure he is. I mean, he was someone with, as we learn throughout the movie, with very primitive origins, very poor origins. And they discuss that in this movie. Once we get past the film reel, we learn that all these journalist guys, these reporters, are trying to figure out what Rosebud means. You know, was it significant in his life? Was it a person? Was it a thing? Was it what was it? And we see that, and we follow one particular reporter as he goes around to a bunch of the people that were involved in Charles Foster Kane's life. We see his business partners. We see his ex-wife, and they all give little kind of tidbits of his life. So we're trying to put together this film and the persona of Charles Foster Kane like a jigsaw puzzle. Notice how I'm hinting at a jigsaw puzzle, which comes to play later on in the movie. And the first person, I think, in the first place that this reporter goes. His name's not really important. I think his name is Thompson, Mr. Thompson. He's kind of hidden in shadow for most of the movie, so we never get to see who he really is. And the movie's not about him, so it doesn't matter. We get to see him go to the Thatcher archives. Thatcher was the guy who was the caretaker or guardian of a young Charles Foster Kane, and we learn the origins how Charles Foster Kane lived in a poor family from Colorado who just happened to fall into some money. Basically, they ran a border house, and a border couldn't pay, so he put up his like rights to a gold mine as collateral, if you will. And then once once that kind of lapsed, the people took over the rights to the gold mine, and it just happened to destroy gold in it. So this family is now rich. So they decided to put all that money in a bank, in a trust fund for their son Charles, and then they also sent him away to live a better life under a more rich person and to really have all of the amenities a wealthy person would have, first-rate education, first-rate living, and all that kind of stuff. So that's the origin of Charles Foster Kane, and we learned that through these archives, which apparently are under like lock and key, and you can only view them at a certain time of day and only a certain amount. It's very secretive. Like they don't want any of this to get out, as if it's like defaming in any way. And it's really just interesting how the film is patchworked together the life of Charles Foster Kane. Stephen, how did you kind of feel about all this? Because we get little tidbits over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, like we've talked about, it's one of the defining things about this movie. It's something, telling this movie in this nonlinear way is something that hadn't really been done very much at that time, that not to this extent. And not only, with this movie, not only is it telling the story this way, but I think you're learning things in a certain order about Charles Foster Kane to help build the character to the point of where he ends up. I mean, it's very smart writing. It's one of the best scripts.
Yeah, the screenplay is incredible. I mean, it's very much non-linear storytelling, so you have to lock yourself in and kind of put the pieces together yourself. Because after this reporter views this archive, he starts going to the people. First, he went to the ex-wife. She didn't want to talk, so he moved on to the archive, and now he's moving on to the people closer to Charles Foster Kane. He's moving on to, I believe, then he moves on to Bernstein, who is played like just perfectly by the actor who he showed up in a couple other Orson Welles films, Everett Sloane. I found him to be one of the funniest parts of this movie. Just the way the person carried this character, I thought was hysterical, especially when you see the flashback scenes to the founding of the Inquirer, the building of the Inquirer, and how Charles Foster Kane started his empire through the stories by this Bernstein character. And just some of the lines this guy has are just hilarious, because he's kind of like almost like Charles Foster Kane's not right hand man, but like his lackey, someone who's like his yes man. He's always kissing up to him. He's always telling him, yes, Mr. Kane, no, Mr. Kane, but Mr. Kane, we can't do this, we can't do that. He's very much his almost quasi assistant, if you will, but he's also kind of running the newspaper along with him. And he tells the story of how Charles Foster Kane met his wife, his first wife, who was the niece of the President of the United States. And he makes up the line where, like, first he marries the president's niece, and then next he's going to end up at the White House. Charles Foster Kane was this larger-than-life character, this big tycoon of a man, and he was kind of in line for great things. But under certain vices, he kind of was the victim of his own decisions, or bad decisions, if you will. And after he sees Mr. Bernstein, he then goes to one of my favorite actors of all time, and that is Joseph Cotten as Mr. Leland, who was the man who was probably Charles Foster Kane's best friend. I believe they went to schools together. And, there's a line that he says where, yeah, I went to school with him, but, yeah, he went to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Cornell, and he went to Europe, and he got kicked out of every school he ever went to. And we get to see how Charles Foster Kane went from a man who had a certain set of principles. He had that declaration that when he first started his newspaper, and how that kind of degraded over time. And we see a lot of that through Mr. Leland and Mr. Bernstein's account. And it's really fascinating, the journey of Charles Foster Kane. The rise and fall. I call this movie basically the rise and fall of Charles Foster Kane. He feels like a real person. I don't know how you feel, Stephen. I feel like this guy is almost like a real person who could have lived in our world.
Oh yeah, definitely. And not trying to jump too far forward, but this movie very much has inspired other movies to tell very similar stories, whether it be There Will Be Blood or Social Network, about people that are in that modern time. Or There Will Be Blood was set closer to this time period actually, but with Social Network, about the rise of Facebook, and as a personal character falling to his lowest points personally. This it does feel like Orson Welles' character Charles Foster Kane is just, you feel like that this could have been a real person and could have been part of history, and that this, it very possibly could have happened.
He kudos to Orson Welles for kind of basing this on real life guys. I know it's a little hazy about his whole take on that. Was he trying to make fun of rich tycoons, if you will, their kind of their influence on society and the degradation of their character over time, stuff like that. But moving on from that, there are several moments of this movie that I think are just fantastic, just extremely well done. There's one of my favorite moments is one of those iconic moments of the movie. I think they show this in every highlight clip of all time, is when he's having his big speech when he's running for governor. And he's got that big sign behind him, and he's at like this rally or whatever, and the camera starts way out and over this huge like ballroom, and it pans in all the way up to him, and the camera is slightly down. What Orson Welles loved to do throughout not only this film but maybe all of his movies to a certain extent, he loved to put the camera down to make the characters seem bigger than they actually were. Whether that was symbolically or on purpose, he loved to do that. He did that several times throughout the movie, where it looked like the camera was literally on the floor at some points. But I just love that speech that he gives. Like I think it's like a week ago or like a month ago, I had less than a hope, and now Jim Geddes has something less than a chance. The guy who he's running against, who's apparently, I believe, is like supposed to be this crooked mob boss or something like that. And that's one of my favorite scenes. Another one of my scenes is after that. After he loses that election, and he's kind of at the Inquirer office, and he has this great scene with Joseph Cotton's character, who's just kind of telling him that this is basically his own fault, the things he's said, the way he's acted. This is kind of the world you've created. What do you think is going? What did you think was going to happen? And it was just a fascinating scene to me. What are some of your favorite scenes?
Well, I was going to say that one's probably my favorite scene, because I just love how, even with in most situations, Charles Foster Kane will get the best of any situation. If he wants something to happen, he'll make it happen, whether it should happen or not. We learn that with Charles's second wife, where he makes her become an opera singer, and even though she doesn't want to become one and doesn't really think she has the talent, he makes her do it. In this situation with his friend, because it's his friend, it was one of the people that, the friend knew he could say he could get out, because he wants to go move to Chicago. And he's like, I want to send me to Chicago. And he tries to tell him, you need to stay. He's like, no, I want to go to Chicago. And it's the one person that was able to get through to him and make him do what he wanted to do, even though he really didn't want him to go, because he was the closest person to him,
I think the leading character was seeing that he was going down a path Kane was going down a path he didn't want to go to, and he couldn't rescue him from. So he's like, I'm gonna go someplace else, go to Chicago, and this whole election thing was definitely the turning point of the character of this movie. I think this whole sequence we're talking about here happens about an hour into the movie, so the film is extremely balanced. The first hour is kind of the rise, the second hour is the fall.
Yeah,
The
it's
movie's
the
only like
beginning of
2
the
hours
fall.
long.
Yeah, it's the
It's the
beginning of
beginning
the
of the
fall,
fall.
and it very much you know it gets to that point in the middle section where he's starting to when that happens and he loses the election. It's one of the first moments where he can't buy, he can't use money to be the or be the reason why something, he can't make something happen. It was the people that told him no, and that
Yeah,
has a reaction in him.
yeah, it was the first time I would say in the movie where we see him being rejected by not only a person but groups of people. And there is a running theme throughout this movie that I've noticed over the many viewings is that Charles Foster Kane wants to be loved above all else. He wants people to like him. He has this bravado and facade on the surface where he's this, he's big money. He buys statues. He could buy anything and do anything. But I think beyond that, and within him is someone crying out to be loved constantly. I mean, and this was the first time I would say in the movie where people didn't love him. People literally rejected him and what he had to say, and they rejected him because of his own decision, because the guy he was running against exposed his infidelity, exposed him as being less of the person that he was projecting to the people. You know what I mean? He's projecting himself in a certain way, and then his image is tarnished because of his actions.
Yeah, I think a lot of just digging into like maybe why Charles was the way he was because I think his upbringing of being sent away by his mother, thinking that she was doing something for him, maybe sending him away to be with rich people and giving away that love between mother and son kind of was part of the reason he thinks that money solves everything. A good life means having money and having things and making things, having that being a little bit of a control freak.
He was searching for the love he never had, and he didn't even know what kind of love it was because he never had it. This idea of unconditional, familial love, parenting love, which he didn't have. He was ripped from his family at a very young age, probably around 10, 11 years old, around there. And he was, fostered by the Thatcher character. And we're not given a lot of background into the relationship between he and Thatcher, but it wasn't a rosy in any way. It wasn't familial. It was a business arrangement, for the lack of a better term. And what we learned throughout the movie is that he constantly rebelled against him. Getting kicked out of all those schools was a rebellion. Buying the Inquirer and running the Inquirer was a rebellion. There's a great scene early on where Thatcher is discussing him about how the Inquirer is not financially feasible. It's like, oh, I saw you lost $1 million last year, and then Kane, in his arrogance, if you will, or his pompousness, goes, yeah, I plan to lose $1 million this year, and then I'll probably lose $1 million next year. But that means basically I'll be out of business in 60 years. I'm paraphrasing, of course. It's one of my favorite moments because he has so much money that even if his business goes belly up, it'll take 60 years for it to happen. So he'll still be successful to a certain extent, and this whole idea of seeking love plays directly back into the Rosebud line. Specifically at the end of the film where we learn what Rosebud is. But before we get to that, another thing that love is another theme in this film is his second marriage, which we haven't spoken of yet, because it was supposed to be a marriage for love. At least he wanted love from it. The entire sequence, which is basically the last half or third of the movie, is the deterioration of the relationship between he and his second wife, and how he was doing everything he possibly could in his own mind, to extrapolate a loving relationship from her. Yet again, seeking that love and acceptance from someone, but kind of going about it in all the wrong ways, because he was just trying to do it with money. He built Xanadu for her. He built the opera house for her. He got her private lessons for her. He tried to make her become a great opera singer. He was probably paying a lot of money just to have these opera houses host her. You know what I mean? Because she wasn't very good, unfortunately. He was trying to make her something that she ultimately wasn't, and he didn't understand how to kind of mend that relationship. He just tried to throw more money at the situation. It's kind of really, really fascinating how stunted of an emotional and social person he was.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely. Not only did he try to solve it through money, but he also, when it didn't go his way, he just took it out on her even more by continuing to embarrass her, by making her continue to do it. And one of his writers writes that bad article, and instead of getting rid of it, which you think he would, he actually finishes it and publishes it, and
That's a great
embarrasses her.
scene.
Yeah,
That's a great scene between he and Joseph Cotton, where Joseph Cotton's passed out on the typewriter, which looks very uncomfortable, and Bernstein's reading him this scathing review of the opera that just opened at this new opera house, and he's kind of laughing it off. And what is interesting is that he could have done pretty much what he did throughout his other publications, basically just pay them to write a good review and force them to write a good review. But no, he decides to prove a point to the Leland character that he is still an honorable person, that he is still someone who can do the right thing, that is someone who is a semblance of the original person he was when he first started the Inquirer. But it ends up backfiring on him in a way, because he has to fire the Leland character because of it. His wife hates it and makes her want to quit at singing. And I feel kind of bad for her because she's not good at it. There's a great scene where they're showing her the opening of the opera, and the camera pans up. Yet again, great, a great. It's not a dolly shot, but a camera shot that pulls up.
a crane shot.
Crane shot. There you go.
Yeah.
There's a crane shot pulls up, and there's the people who are basically like the stagehands, like looking at each other and like, no, this isn't good. And then they redo that shot later on, and instead of focusing on the stagehands, they go to Foster Kane, who has one of the most gifable moments of all time. I mean, I've seen this gif show up everywhere, where he does the clapping, and with a stern face, and then he gets up and he's the last one to clap, and then the look on his face changes from the sternness to the, wow, this is not going well.
Yeah,
this is really screwed up.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing about it is, and it really shows the selfishness of Charles Foster Kane, is that it wasn't about how it made her look, and it was about how it made him. He felt like it made him look. It wasn't about her; it was about him.
Yeah. Yeah, and afterward, where she wants to quit, and he says, "No, you can't quit. It would look." He's basically saying that it would look bad for him, and yet again, that goes back to the idea of wanting a positive public persona, wanting people, specifically just random people out there, to love him in every way, to accept him and think of him in a positive way. And that negativity reflects on him, and it kind of, I assume, it kind of eats at him as he's gotten older and older, and we see how bitter and just emotionally unstable he has gotten towards the later years of his life. where he's just living in this gigantic house with all these statues and all these paintings, and he's got elephants and camels and whatever and Xanadu, and he is just completely and utterly alone. And it is probably his worst nightmare because he wanted people to love him, and now he's just unloved and alone. And that's how he tragically ends his life. I view him as a tragic figure, someone who ends up in the worst possible case for him. And that's where we get to the road. We come full circle. The movie kind of goes full circle back to the Rosebud. And Rosebud he had when he was a kid, going back to what we discussed earlier, this idea of him not having a childhood, not having a childhood filled with love and parenting and stuff like that, and kind of just being the product of a business arrangement, you know. And I guess as he got older in life, he began to reflect a lot upon that, because when he first picks up the snow globe is after he's trashed the room, after his wife has left him. He had what I like to call a Charles Foster Kane meltdown moment, where he just trashes everything.
Which I think Tommy Wiseau from The Room completely ripped that off.
Oh yeah, yes. Anytime someone trashes the room, I just think of that. Oh yeah, he definitely did. And he picks up the snow globe and shakes it, and he sees the snow. The snow reminds him of his childhood in Colorado with the sled, and it comes full circle. And there's another amazing shot in that trash room sequence where all the help is outside and they're kind of just like sitting there in awkward silence, and he walks out in like this angered trance, and for some reason there's this mirror in this hallway, and that shot I find to be amazing. I love mirror shots in movies. I think you could do so much with them, and you see just the reflection of him he's down this hallway, and it's an amazing shot.
He's beside himself.
It almost shows how fractured he is as a person, because the mirror just shows him like fracturing, and then moving all the way down the line until he probably disappears, because he's kind of disappeared within himself in this movie, kind of bringing us back to the beginning where he's basically living in a haunted house and he is the ghost. He is the person haunting this house. And it is an astonishing movie with so many layers that we've barely grasped the surface of. And that's why I think this movie is essential, because there's so much in it. There's so much in it from a technical standpoint, from a screenplay standpoint, filmmaking standpoint, and a story and character standpoint. It's just amazing on so many levels. And that's why it's one of my favorites of all time, and it is, I think, an essential for any cinephile or film fan.
Yeah, I mean, I of course I totally agree. I mean, I think it's one of them stories that has a timeless feel to it, because, like I said before, this story has been retold in different ways by other filmmakers, over the years. Like I said, for mostly my biggest instances have been There Will Be Blood, where you got Daniel Day-Lewis's character, an oil tycoon who, is raising his son, and then, he's become this evil man, and at the end has a very similar end, except it goes a little bit differently where he kills somebody. And then in The Social Network, he is this very smart guy that basically is alone at the end because he's, taken away all his friends, pushed away all his friends because of his pursuit of this making money in Facebook and trying to be loved by somebody. Very similar to Charles Foster Kane in this movie.
Think, I mean, we're kind of saying it in a roundabout way. It's kind of the template for the biopic, or at least the modern day biopic. There weren't really a lot of biopics at the time being made in 1941 around that time. And there have been, many afterwards, but it's interesting that it's a biopic that sets up the template for biopics about not a real person. It's kind of a faux biopic about a larger-than-life person. And it's just astonishing how many generations have learned from this movie after it came out. I know it's a huge influence on many directors, too many to name. Probably some of our favorites have watched it, many times. And it's truly astonishing. Yeah, I could go on and on about Orson Welles' genius. He's one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. Like I said earlier, there's nothing quite like an Orson Welles film. Unfortunately, this is considered his best because it's one of the only films where he had full control over. He had final cut on this film, which was a rarity at the time, especially in the studio system of the golden age of Hollywood. The studio controlled everything. And he is someone who is an auteur. There weren't a lot of auteurs at the time, and not especially in the Hollywood system. There's no room for auteurism if the studio is controlling everything. Unfortunately, throughout Orson Welles' career, his films were taken away from him in post-production and re-edited. This happened with Touch of Evil. This happened with A Lady from Shanghai. This happened with many of his movies, and he struggled throughout his entire career to really make any of his movies, well, let alone if they were his versions or not. He only completed 13 films throughout his career, which was basically from 1941 to 1986 or 85 when he died, around there. And he didn't get to complete much. And there's tons of stuff that is incomplete that they're trying to complete now in various ways, whether it's through Kickstarter campaigns or whatever. And to me, one of the biggest losses, I think, in at least American cinema history is that Orson Welles never got the opportunities that filmmakers get to have now. The idea that they get to make their own movies. Indie film in the indie film world really didn't exist at the time, where you could fund and make your own movies and have final cut and all that stuff. He never got any of those opportunities, but he's always been an interesting figure to me. He's not a perfect figure in any way. He was notoriously difficult to work with, but he was a huge prodigy as well. I mean, we haven't even mentioned it yet. He made this movie when he was around, 24, 25 years old. He was born in 19.
This is the best.
1915. And this movie came out in 41, so you can do the math there.
Yeah, this is probably the best film debut by any director I think ever made.
At 25.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember when I was 25 years old, I wasn't making movies. Even before this, he was leading the Mercury Theater with stage productions and theatrical things in his early 20s, earlier than 25. He was quite an interesting person, but you can find documentaries about him, books about him. You can find interviews with him online. His interviews, especially when he got older in his life, are particularly entertaining because he was a notorious storyteller. He would say stuff, and some of the stuff may not be real or may not have actually happened, but at least it's interesting and entertaining. He's just a master manipulator of stories and facts and all this kinds of stuff. There was one shot in this movie that we haven't discussed yet, happens way in the third act, happens like the last 15 minutes, where the scene transition is just a bird screaming. and it's like, and I remember, I think it was Dick Cavett interviewing him in the 70s, asked, why did you have that in the movie? And he goes, oh, it was just to wake the audience up. And I was just like, okay, that makes sense, I guess. Whatever. Who knows why it was actually really in the movie. It's certainly unique in every way. And Orson Welles was definitely a unique character. Just any final thoughts on Citizen Kane? Because we could go on and on about this movie forever.
Oh yeah. I mean, one last little point I wanted to bring up was this is a great example of I bring this up in other things I've talked about movies that start out at the end. A lot of times movies will start at the end and go and tell you the rest of the story, and you're like, well, did they really have to do that? Like, is it necessary to start at the end and then work our way back to the end? This movie does it perfectly because it gives us something to work towards, but sometimes movies just do it because it's cool, like this has a purpose, and it doesn't, and it's not manipulative. It's about the character, and it works perfectly for this. I just wish more movies would do it with purpose and not just, just because,
Yeah, I mean, this is an early introduction of a MacGuffin. I mean, the Rosebud name itself is just a MacGuffin. It's just something to kick off the movie with and have people look for, but it's really about Charles Foster Kane. But it does come back to the end, giving us the reveal of what Rosebud really is, and then you can actually look at the rest of the movie and see why Rosebud is significant, like we've discussed throughout this video. So it's like, it's not the usual use of a MacGuffin. Usually MacGuffins by the end of the movie are kind of just thrown away. It's like they're just used as a plot device. This one actually has a meaning for the whole movie.
Yeah, and MacGuffins a lot of times are actual things. They're something that the characters are going after, and in this case, it's more of a thought, an idea that they're trying to just figure out.
There's an actual physical object, but it's it's more of an idea, like we
I mean, if they would have actually found out it was a sled, they would have been like, well, it's a sled. He liked a sled. Like they wouldn't have known the significance. The only person that knows is Charles Foster Kane and the audience. So that's why I say it's more of about the idea of it than the actual sled itself. Because some people actually get upset out when I talk to people about Citizen Kane. They're like, yeah, but that was stupid. It's a sled. I'm like, did you not pay attention to the movie?
It's not. It's what the sled means, people. It's what the sled means. It's not the actual object.
He just really loves sledding.
Yeah. He just misses those cold Colorado winters, apparently. But Citizen Kane is like one of the most talked about movies of all time, like we've discussed. You can watch it if you haven't yet on DVD, Blu-ray, find a VHS copy, Laserdisc, film reel. If you can watch it on the big screen film reel,
a lot of times,
that'd be probably awesome.
A lot of times, if you have like an old theater that plays old movies, or we got a couple of them around me. They'll play it yearly. During the summertime, they'll show a screening of it. And you can rent it probably on YouTube. I rented it on YouTube to rewatch it. I need to buy it.
Yeah. I bought it years ago. Actually, when it first came out on Blu-ray, I bought this edition here. The Ultimate Collector's Edition, put out by Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers loves to put out their ultimate collector's editions of their movies. And this has Citizen Kane on Blu-ray. This has the documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane, like we talked about, the whole thing with William Randolph Hearst and all that stuff. And this one also has a movie that is actually an HBO movie based on the making of Citizen Kane, called RKO 281. This movie was put out by RKO, which is kind of a now defunct studio, but at the time it was pretty big, especially in the 30s and into the 40s. It kind of changed hands, changed names a few times. It was RKO Radio Pictures and all kinds of stuff. Watch Citizen Kane any way you can, anywhere you can. And Steven, where can people find you all around the internet?
Oh, yeah, just Facebook, Steven Billings. You can go to Instagram or Stardust at MovieMan16, and that's where you see me mostly.
Righto. You can find me on Twitter at Cabzilla06, as well as my YouTube channel, Cabzilla Productions. I'm also on Stardust, just started at Cabzilla. I think that's what I put it as. I only have a few things up there now, but you can also find all of these videos, all 52 of these things, whenever we're finished, here on our friend Dan Skip Allen's YouTube channel, Best Damn Movie Show. And yeah, until next time, keep watching those movies.
I know I will.